Hello and welcome! In this video, I will be going over some basic drawing techniques to render a simple flower, the poppy. Poppies are very simply shaped and very few petals compared to other flowers. There's also a wide variety. We'll go through 3 drawings together, and each drawing will be turned into a free downloadable coloring page. But before we get into those 3 examples, we're going to start with something even simpler, the egg. We'll look at how light transforms the simple shape of an egg and how simple shapes make up the components of a flower and their pollinator friends. First things first, let's start with materials. So we're going to want 2 pencils, the HB and the 5B. These 2 pencils provide enough depth for a decent render. You can have a wide variety of pencils if you choose, but I just like these 2. The HB is a great initial sketch pencil, and then the 5B really provides good darks for your shadows. Erasers, sharpeners, and then also the optional blending tool. This is just the sharpener, which is like sandpaper to sharpen the tool. So the reason why we have 2 pencils instead of 1 is you really want to create darks in your drawing to provide depth. So here I'm doing the gradient of just the HB pencil, and we have a gradient, there's some contrast, it's not too bad, but it's not very dark. Your piece would be a bit flat if you just use this one. And this 5B pencil, you can initially see that it is quite darker. Using the same amount of pressure, it's just a softer pencil, so there's more graphite on the paper. And I'll show you one with a really hard graphite. This is a 2H, and using the same amount of pressure, doing the same thing, you see it's a lot lighter. So if we had, done a drawing in just this pencil, it would come out really light and really flat. So I prefer the HB for initial sketch, and the 5B or maybe even higher for darker darks. They go up to, I believe, a 9B. And you can use more if you want, but I think just 2 works great for doing some simple botanical sketches. Going in and using the blending tool, what it does is just softens up your gradient. These blending tools come in different sizes. I still prefer often to use the larger one because they all go to about the same point. Use your sharpener to kind of get rid of the graphite on the tip. These blending tools are just pulled up paper, so it just erodes the paper off or scratches the paper off with the sandpaper. And you want to have a clean surface to work with. Work in your gradient going from dark to light. You could go from light to dark if you wanted a smaller gradient, but you don't want to be going back and forth because you're going to have some graphite on the tip of your blending tool, and then you're going to start essentially drawing with it in your gradient, which you don't want. But if you're pulling graphite out from the gradient, you could use it to make some more subtle details in the light area by pulling it out, which is great for petals because there's a lot of subtle textures and highlights and shadows in the lighter portions of petals. Then also, if your sharpener doesn't have a container, you're going to want to have a can on hand to put your shavings in. I use this one, which is nice. I just found it. Also, one thing I'll show you is I use the small eraser for small erasing. A lot of times the large eraser, if you're going to go in, takes too much out off your page. So I like this for pulling out highlights and just little details in the shaded areas. And I will use the eraser in the last example. So we're going to start simple. You can do this exercise at home. It would be great if you had a white egg instead of a brown one to show the differences more, but this is a simple shape. And what we're going to do is really break down the flowers and insects into simple shapes. But as we can see with this oval, there's a lot of difference in it. And depending on the surface around it, the highlights and shadows and the color changes a great deal depending on what's around it. The reflected light gives the 2D shape dimension, and so as you can see on the base of the egg you have a little highlight which is reflected light from the surface. You have your main highlight from your main light source, which I have numerous light sources here, which is why you see kind of the blue edges on the right side and the left side as well from a window, but the main light source is lit from the upper left hand side, and so the shadow is going to be cast below that, and then the highlight will be underneath that as well. And I'm kind of showing the differences between the surface texture. This is cloth, and so you're not going to have a stark reflected highlight, but it still gave a green tone. Compared to something like this, which you could easily see gives a harsh highlight. So when we place this egg onto the surface, you can see how the surface transforms that egg, and you can really see the highlight on the bottom. The highlight is always there regardless of the shape, but the intensity depends on the surface around it and the light around it. So maybe if you're in a shadowy area or in the dark, you're not going to see as much reflected light, but all these reflected lights are going to be there, and if you can put them in your drawing, it's what gives your drawing dimension. We're going to start just drawing out an egg, and this is a great exercise. I recommend doing it multiple times with changing the light source and seeing how the shadow changes. I put in a little circle for the highlight, which in my case is the upper left hand side, and I put that there so I know I'm kind of working around that space, but no graphite should go into that area, and later I'll erase it. So working with the HB pencil to get the basic shape down and put in some basic tones. It's good to work lighter and gradually build up your darker darks. So I can see most of this core shadow is on the right hand side and it's angled. And it's kind of like we want to think of it as the light falling over this shape. So we really think of what this shape is and how the light falls over it. So we're going to see that dark area right underneath where the egg is the widest. But we also have this light coming up for underneath. So you have essentially two gradients of light that bend with the shape. So I kind of get the initial sketch down. Okay, darken it up. You want to create contrast. The more contrast you have, I think the better render it is. A lot of people tend to go too light, which is again why we want to be using multiple pencils, because just using one pencil won't provide you that option to go very dark. So I'll erase that little circle highlight I put in there, and then go in with the blending tool and just soften everything up, because this is a very soft textured egg. And one thing to note is that the reflected light underneath will never be as light as where the direct light source is hitting the surface. So the brightest part is going to be where the light directly hits in that top left hand side, and any other light will be a lot less prominent, but still there. So let's go into our first drawing of a poppy. And these are great because they're only 4 petals. We're going to be working from this photograph, which as you can see is quite simple. We can already see some basic shapes. So the overall flower is just a circle. We have another circle inside on where the pollen is, and we have a bee that's kind of up and to the left, which kind of to me looks like a triangle. Now all these things are not perfect shapes, but it's good to get these shapes down and identify their placement. Like the bee is not in the center of the flower. the pollen is not in the center of the flower, and it's because we're looking at it above, but also from an angle. And we're not looking at it directly above. And so placing in those shapes in relation to each other is our first step. And after we get those shapes down, kind of looking at it, it's like, okay, this flower is not a perfect circle. All these petals have ridges and the petals come down. There's some angles to it. That bee is not a perfect triangle. It's actually rounded on all corners or on all sides. And changing the shapes a bit to better accurately represent the image. And it's good to go the smaller shapes, the seat you see. Get everything down, like even within the bee, what kind of shapes are on the bee. You can break the shape method down, I guess, as small and as far down as you want to, as you can, and it makes it easier to draw thinking of it that way. So this is the coloring page that I made for it. I just threw my initial sketch that I did into Procreate and digitally drew over it. I did add in some leaves because they're pretty cool and it gives the composition a more polished look. I always just pull from a few different reference photos, which is always great, so you can create your own composition. This is our second specimen that we're going to work with, and we have this slowed down to half speed, but it's really cool to kind of look at the shapes of this guy, and especially since he's iridescent, you can see where the light is hitting the shapes of his body and how they're kind of trailing off, and really just see how his body is made up of simple shapes. Even how the pollen is, covering the legs and the abdomen, there's some dimension and shapes there. Like, they're essentially just clinging on to other shapes. This is the still that we're going to be working with. And it might look a lot more complicated than the last one, but again, breaking it down into shapes, it's not that difficult. We have that center area with the pollen is a circle, and you can tell there's kind of like another smaller circle inside. All the petals just essentially radiate out of that center circle, and the bee is just hovering or walking over the pollen and is kind of arched over around it in a similar fashion as the circle. Looking at where the antennas are at and where the abdomen is at and how they relate to the circle, and breaking, you can break these things down into shapes. Bugs are really great to draw because they are so shape-based. They're pretty hard in their shapes. You can tell that his eye is very circular. The head is very strong in its shape. The abdomen. So really breaking it down, and you can even break down the abdomen in its own little shapes. The legs have its own little sections. The wings are pretty straight. It might be one of the few kind of like straight lines that we have in this drawing. Just going in and putting in the basic shapes and then tweaking them. There's going to be a lot of asymmetry. I'm going to put in essentially little rounded top cylinders in for the center of the flower. Darken up areas, tweak stuff. I noticed with this drawing I had put the head initially quite small, and I didn't realize it until much later. And that's totally okay. You just erase it and make a little bit bigger. But it's good to have those shapes down there, even if they're incorrect to begin with, and then you can kind of tweak and see, oh wait, this is too small because it needs to reach this space or this reference point. And as long as you have something down, you can see how the things relate to each other and keep erasing and adjusting until you feel like it's accurately represented. And here's the coloring page. And with this last example, we're going to be working from a larger poppy. And they are a little bit more complicated than the first one, but they're still quite simple with these large rectangular petals and circular shape in the center. So we're going to be working from this photograph. And immediately we can see that this flower is a bit more rectangular than the first example, and the petals have some definite line shapes to them. So the first thing that we'll do is break down those shapes. I start with a general large rectangle and then go from there with the stamen in the center and block out the individual petals. And then after that, you want to detail the edges of the shapes to kind of get them more formed towards what's in the image. And in this example, I'm going to focus more on the third step of adding values, highlights, and shadows. And we're basically going to take the same approach to adding in those as we did in the first step of the initial drawing, is what are the basic shapes? So to kind of identify the shapes of the shadows and the highlights, I blur my eyes and then just block in those shapes. It's really easy to get caught up in the details at first because, especially in this photo, we can see like above the stamen on the back petal, even though it's in shadow compared to the rest of the flower, there's lots of highlights and shadows and details in there, but we don't want to look at those details first. We just kind of want to see that, okay, it's darker than the rest of the flower. I'm going to go in with my HB pencil and just block in that back area. Also on the lower left-hand side, there's a shadow shape there. Just go in and block it out. And just kind of identifying all of the different shadow shapes, the highlight shapes, and blocking them out. Then after you do the initial block out, do the same thing, add in more tones or add in more details. And the stamen in the center looks a bit difficult, like there's a lot of detail in there, but again, breaking down the shapes. So to me, the stamen looked like little hockey sticks. So I'm just drawing in small little hockey sticks in that area every which way. And it kind of represents the same thing versus trying to minutely replicate what you see in the photo exactly. And also when adding in the details of the petals, it has a lot of kind of rippling effects. And again, just understanding why those ripples are there. It's the light falling over the surface of this petal, and these are really delicate petals with a bit of a wave to them. So the highlights and the shadows on the petals that create those lines are the waves, and you're seeing how the light reacts to the waves on the petal. So understanding that, you can just do a few lines if you want to capture the essence of what's going on there versus just counting all the lines and putting the exact amount on the page. And also, especially when adding in shadows and stuff like that, I always work, because I am right-handed in drawing, left to right, so I don't smudge my work as much. If you're left-handed, you might want to work the opposite way, because you see my hand will be pressed on the paper, and if you're working from right to left, if you're right-handed, you're going to be smudging all your work and creating a bit of a mess. Something to think about. And then again, especially with this one, I'm going to go over the whole thing with the blending tool, which gives the entire flower a bit of color, in a way. Gives it some more tone. But I'm not blending in the areas that I had already marked off to be highlighted areas that are white. And I think I had the tips of the flowers are those areas. Then after I got the blending done, kind of went in and added, crisped some of the edges that were lost in the blending, darkening up some of those areas as well, and then using that small eraser and picking up any highlights, especially pulling them out of the shadows. And here's the final coloring page. And thank you so much for watching.